The storm came down the spine of Varellus 9 like a living thing, all teeth and intent, scouring the flats until even the horizon forgot where it belonged. Valera had learned the first law of exile quickly. If you cannot outrun the wind, persuade it to forget you exist. She dragged a torn insulation panel over the shallow ditch where she'd laid the twins, packed snow against its edges with numb hands, then pressed her body across the makeshift lid so her warmth would bleed downward instead of upward to the hungry sky. The Carax had called her sterile in the council ring, and the word had moved through the crowd like a cold front, icing every face. By dusk, the verdict had become geography, and geography had become the walk that brought her here. She rationed breath as if it were currency, counted the twins' thin exhalations against the rhythm of the gale, and hummed the threadbare tune of a nursery song into the panel so the vibration might travel where her voice could not. When the panel flexed and tried to buck from the pressure, she held fast and let the snow climb over her back, a deliberate burial that would buy them insulation if not mercy. Somewhere in the white, a beacon pulsed. Distant, irregular, a heartbeat translated by weather. Yet she could not tell if it belonged to a machine or the memory of comfort she had forbidden herself to recall. Her mate had gone still 2 weeks earlier, beneath a smaller storm, and she had used the last of his matches without ceremony. Grief was a luxury the cold could spend for you. Ice crept into the hairline cracks along her frill and pressed there like a tutor correcting posture. She ignored the pain because it was a kind of proof that she was not finished. A gust broke, the world inhaled, and in that brief absence of noise, she whispered to the twins that the wind grew weaker each time it bragged. They did not answer, but their small bodies shifted in the snow with the stubbornness shared by children and seeds. The panel thrummed once more, soft, then steady, until the tremor beneath her chest matched it, and she understood the pulse was real and drawing closer, a red blink threading the white. Valera closed her eyes, pressed her palm flat, and promised the old sky she would take any rescue offered, even if it arrived wearing a human face. Thorn Halvek had come to Varellus 9 for silence and found only noise with better manners. Wind gnawing at metal seams, a stove's old cough, the polite click of grief whenever he forgot to expect it. The Terran medic had been a good husband in a life with fewer storms, and the word widower still felt like a coat he had borrowed from a stranger because no one else wanted it. He wore it thinly, at the edge of towns and at the edge of himself. He took the supply sled out between squalls to check the survey masts he kept standing for no one in particular, telling himself the habit was practical, while knowing it was simply a way to replace the sound of his own heartbeat with engines. At mast 7, the battered sensor spat an anomaly through the snow. Heat under drift where no heat should be, too weak for an animal, too persistent for a fluke. He killed the sled, let the sudden quiet settle like a hand on a fevered brow, and listened until the wind admitted there was another rhythm mixed into its bragging. The medic in him did what training teaches men to do long after they stop wanting to. He clipped a line to the sled, checked the avalanche angle with a glance, and weighed it in with a collapsible probe and a curse he had not used since the siege at Car's Gate. The probe kissed resistance. Then something that was not ice, and his chest tightened in the old way that means there is a life involved, and it has decided to test you. He widened the hole with a field shovel, eased an insulation panel aside, and found a face he had never expected to see again this far from anyone's kindness. An alien woman rhymed with frost, eyes cracked half open in the practiced disbelief of the almost dead, mouth shaping a plea not for herself but for what lay beneath her. "Don't. Leave them," she managed, and the syllables shoved 10 years of numbness off his back with more efficiency than any therapist had managed. He had done triage in places that had forgotten their own names. The motions returned, honest and unadorned. He slid the thermal blanket under her shoulders without stealing the heat she had hoarded for the twins, cracked a chemical pack and tucked it along her spine, then wormed one arm beneath to reach the small bodies nested in the snow. One child's breath snagged on the edge of silence until his gloved knuckles found a sternum and remembered the precise, stubborn pressure that argues with that kind of quitting. The other stirred when he tilted her chin, and fog lit the air. He strapped the twins into the sled's emergency alcove, sealed the blanket around the woman with the greedy exactness of a man who refuses to donate warmth to weather, and lashed them all down as the gust returned to test knots. He spoke aloud, because voices are tools in storms, counting, promising, insulting the wind with the affectionate profanity veterans reserve for forces too large to shoot. Then he walked the rope back hand over hand, boots seeking purchase, as if the planet might reconsider him, and drove the sled home through white that kept trying to convince him forward and back were the same direction. The cabin welcomed them with the startled intake of a room that had not held this much life in years. He swung the door shut with his hip, kicked the latch, and let heat practice forgiveness. On the hearth he set broth to thaw and water to boil, staged blankets in layers like a campaign, and laid out hypo, heater, pulsox, and the old dog tag he'd begun to slip off in bad weather and had, this morning, forgotten to remove. When the woman's eyes found him again, not as a hazard, but as a fact, he said the only sentence that fit both medicine and life. "You're safe for the next 5 minutes. We'll keep buying the next 5 after that." Heat did not so much save them as tutor their bodies back into the habit of living, and Thorn treated the lesson like a field manual he trusted more than prayer. He cut the twins free of the ice crust with a pocket knife dulled by good use, slid gel warmers into the hollows of neck and armpit, and counted out breaths until the numbers began to feel less like a dare and more like a plan. When the pulsox blinked a grudging green, he let himself exhale for the first time since the shovel struck the panel. Valira resisted the return to consciousness the way the wounded do when pain is the first thing waiting on the surface, but the broth he held at her lip smelled of cumin and marrow, and the unambitious mercy of a long-simmered stock, and her mouth learned the motion again, even before her pride did. "Careful," he said, not as an order, but as an observation offered for her to accept or reject, and her eyes, tracking the voice as if it were a moving light in a cave, settled on his face with the wary concentration of a climber choosing the next handhold. In the twins, the thaw revealed mismatched tempers. The smaller, frill-tipped with winter blue, kept a white-knuckled grip on Valira's wrist and blinked too rarely, conserving everything. The larger, whose crest flared in faint pulses of green gold when the room's heat kissed it, fought the oxygen mask twice and then cooperated ferociously, attacking survival the way hungry things attack bread. Thorn, who had delivered babies in siege tunnels and closed eyes in quieter rooms, let his hands do their old work and his mouth do its newer one. Narration, small and steady, the human grammar of first this, then that invites panic to step aside. Names arrived after numbers. Valira's voice came thin at first, like wind crossing a bottle mouth. She said the twins were called Nail and Sarah, syllables worn smooth by rocking and repetition, and that the clan had declared her line sterile after a council of men counted lineage like coins and decided her dead mate's brothers had better claims. Sterile here meant unworthy of inheritance, a bureaucratic fiction with the appetite of a god, and Thorn catalogued the cruelty and put it where he kept other facts that made him efficient rather than loud. He asked nothing about the ring circle or the verdict march to the wastes. He asked if the burns along her frill were old or new, and when she did not answer, he oiled the cracked edges with salve and moved on to the job that sat closer to the fire, teaching the room to be on their side. He cracked the shutter to let the storm's voice fall from a shout to a mutter, set the kettle to the back where it could think, and built a stand of wood over the hearth to keep the gel warmers from failing, while the twins' cores relearned the labor that heat had been doing for them. When Nail's hands finally unclenched, stiff and embarrassed, Thorn pressed a mug into them that was mostly warm water and honey and a memory of tea. Sarah tracked the steam with her eyes like a scholar, decided it was safe because he was not watching her decide, and drank. They found a shared language in objects. Valira flinched when he moved toward her frill too quickly, so he narrated the salve and put it within her reach. Later she took the tin without looking at him, and the room acquired a new rule without needing a vote. The twins learned kettle before they learned thorn, chanting it as the old copper pot began to mutter like a forgiving ant. He learned the Karak's word for blanket, 2 syllables that felt like a hand smoothing linen, and repeated it until Valera stopped correcting his vowel. He made a ceremony of very small things. The first time Sarah licked a spoon clean and looked surprised by her own appetite, he tapped the table twice with his knuckle to seal the pact between taste and life. When Nail tried to stand and failed with dignity, Thorn moved the stool half a step closer without announcing the adjustment. Later, in the narrow hours when the storm finally remembered it had other places to be, he strung a new line over the stove for drying socks and set 3 pegs by the door. 1 high, 1 low, 1 at a child's indecisive height, and the geometry of the room changed to admit the idea of staying. He left his old dog tag on the windowsill because he could not wear it tonight. Sarah, who had already worked out where everything in the cabin belonged, picked it up, weighed it like a coin that could buy something important, and set it next to Valera's salve, as if arranging a trade between past and present. She spoke more when the children slept, and the kettle wrote patient punctuation into the air. The clan's law had not been written for healers who failed to give sons to the ring. The word sterile traveled ahead of her like an envoy with a knife, and the sentence for carrying it was a road with no end. Thorn kept his questions in his pocket, where good questions live until they earn their supper. Instead, he told her about a woman who had taught him how to plant tomatoes in terrible soil, and how grief had made him forget to water anything that wasn't trying to kill him. "You expect me to believe a soldier can cook soup?" Valera said, not quite teasing, and he shrugged, because he didn't expect anything, not belief and not forgiveness, only the continued opportunity to add broth and keep the fire at the right mood. When she asked, cautiously, why a human had stopped for a red blink in a white world that owed him nothing, he said the line that had saved him in other storms. "Because I was there, and because I could." That answer did not impress her pride, but it satisfied her body. She slept at last in the ugly, useful way exhausted people do. Mouth open, one hand still spread over the twins as if the earth might try to steal them back. Morning taught them each other's noises. The stove's tick as iron cooled meant the hour for broth had passed and the hour for bread had not yet arrived. Nail's soft cluck at the back of his throat meant fear with no object. Sarah's humming meant mischief that would be worth the cleanup. Valera woke, touched the healed edges of her frill as if inventorying a ship after a storm, and stared at the peg by the door where a child-sized coat had appeared, pieced together from an old sweater and a length of tarp twine. "We will earn this," she said, the Karak's cadence turning promise into something like a contract, and Thorn nodded in a human way that means a contract is already in effect and the payment plan is, stay. The storm ran out of ideas by noon and left behind the brittle hush that follows arguments. But on Varelis 9, peace is just the pause before weather chooses a new weapon. Thorn stepped outside to strip ice from the solar rack, and the horizon gave him the kind of gift you only accept with your jaw clenched. 3 long shapes moving in files across the hardpack, low and deliberate, their coats the color of old bone, their heads too sleek for anything friendly. The storm wolves came down from the ridge, when the air went from knife to club, hunting the weak and the unclaimed. Men in the settlement told stories about them when they wanted to sound brave, and then changed the subject when the kettle boiled. He went back in without shutting the door, and the room understood the shape of his movement before the words arrived. Valera rose in one motion, eyes already calculating, and slid the twins behind the bunk, with a look that made even the furniture obey. "Not men," he said, because she knew that already. And fast, because there was no shame in calling speed by its first name. Preparation made a quiet racket, the sound good rooms make when they remember they know how to help. Thorn hauled the sled's panel inside and wedged it between bunk and wall to become a barricade a child could believe in. Valera checked the shutter latches with the deftness of someone who had been forced to learn failing hardware by cold tutoring. Sarah, recruited into the oldest militia, those who hold doors, planted her small hands against the wood and set her jaw like a blacksmith. Nail collected the gel packs and arranged them in a line, as if daring the wolves to argue with logistics. Thorn slung the rifle, not because he wanted to use it, but because nothing ruins a lesson like lacking the right prop. And then, as the first shadow scraped the yard, he did the single unmilitary thing that has saved more lives than gunfire. He lit the stove to angry and yanked the ash drawer open. The rush of hot air hit the doorway like a wall. The draft turned the cabin's breath outward. The smell of human heat and iron and stubbornness declared a territory most predators pick their teeth and leave alone. These wolves were young or hungry or both. They tested the latch that had survived older storms, pushed noses under the shutter to taste heat, and made the frustrated cough that means a body suddenly knows it is not the largest fact in the room. When one tried the hinge, Thorn met it with a boot and a curse that had frightened better things. And Valera laughed, a single sharp note, not at the danger but at the way he spoke to it, as if it were weather trying to bill him twice. The cabin held because he had built it for holding, and because she had found its weak joints and disciplined them, and because the twins were adding their body weight to Thorn's decisions without complaint. He was ready to fire when the lead wolf made the mistake of climbing the woodpile. The movement shifted its weight into the open, where Math could reach it, and Valera, faster than any human could be without becoming a different story, slid the sled rope through the handle of the ash drawer and jerked. A gout of sparking heat fountained out, not enough to burn but enough to teach, and the wolf learned and then remembered an appointment elsewhere. The other two followed with the offended dignity of creatures that imagine themselves above negotiation. The last turned and hissed at the door, and Sarah hissed back with a ferocity that made Thorn grateful she liked him. He shut the ash drawer, and the stove returned to its work. And in the quiet that rushed in, he realized the cabin had acquired a new sound. 3 hearts beating within the same set of walls on purpose. After, the children shook in the way small bodies do when delayed fear and sudden hunger collide. Thorn managed the trembling with bread, and the hunger with stew, and the fear with the truth spoken almost casually. We did that well. And Valera managed his pride with a look that said, try not to enjoy being necessary too much. She sat at the edge of the bunk and taught the twins a Carex hand game that turned counting into a song. And for the first time, Thorn saw what the council had been coward enough to banish, the way she could turn fright into focus without lying to anybody. Your door holds, she said later, tracing the grain with one finger as if memorizing the wood like a map, and he answered, it was looking for a reason. He wanted to ask about the ring circle again, and did not. She wanted to ask how many rooms like this he had built for men who did not survive to enjoy them, and did not. Instead, they argued about soup, the way families do when they need to keep the air warm. She called his stock too Terran, which he translated as too polite. He called her spice too Carex, which she took as a compliment and pretended not to. The next morning, the wolves had gone and a new weather arrived. Sky like hammered tin, wind taking attendance but not assigning work. Thorn pulled on his boots and announced the trip to the wrecked shelter site, the way captains announce a course, even though the crew consisted of 1 alien healer with a ripped coat and 2 children whose job titles had just been upgraded to assistant inventory clerks. They retraced the route he had cut through the drifts by instinct and returned by knowledge, the sled singing a lower song now that it pulled hope instead of the near dead. At the ditch, the panel lay where he had pried it up, snow crusted hard along its lip. Valera knelt and touched that edge with a tenderness that did not ask permission from grief, then stood and surveyed what could be salvaged, as if she were judging a battlefield she intended to reclaim. They found a usable stove eye, a coil of wire, a length of alley plank that would make a proper shelf if taught manners. Nail discovered a charm carved from bone and held it up as if offering the day a treaty. Sarah, who had appointed herself the expedition's herald, announced each find to the wind as if drafting a proclamation. When they hauled it all home, the cabin politely rearranged itself around the possibility of a second room someday. And Thorn felt in his wrists the ache that meant lumber would be cut and nails argued into boards, and a door would be taught to hold because doors crave purpose as much as men do. Valera paid rent the only way he would accept it, by improving the place. She relashed the shutter with a double loop. His hands would have learned in a month, and hers knew already. Set the wire to hanging 3 cups where small hands could reach without asking, and taught the twins to stack wood in a pattern that would make tomorrow easier for the person who might not have slept. She tried to leave one afternoon, taking nothing but a wrapped loaf and a resolve that looked very much like fear wearing armor. And the snowfield gave her one honest, unromantic step before the twins' hands, each on a hem of her coat, told her a truer story. "There is nothing behind you but weather," Thorn said from the doorway, not pleading, not commanding, and the line broke something tough inside the day that had needed breaking. She came back in without looking at him, hung the coat on the proper peg, and sorted his toolbox with the sly patience of a person who intends to stay and will not embarrass anyone by saying so too loudly. That night, she leaned on the door with both palms and pushed once theatrically until the hinges complained and the latch answered, and then she turned to him with the kind of smile that makes a room learn a new word for yes. Later, when the children slept and the stove ticked like a cricket that had learned manners, Thorn took his dead wife's ring from the tin where he kept unspendable coins. He did not put it on or away. He set it on the sill next to the dog tag and the salve, and the 3 small circles looked, in the moonlight, like a diagram of old lives intersecting with the new. Valera saw and did not reach for it. Instead, she slid a thin braided cord from her wrist. Clan make, the kind of thing girls wove for one another before councils learned their names, and laid it beside the ring without letting the two touch. "A house," she said, tasting the Terran word as it gave up its iron and turned warm, "is a promise with walls." Thorn looked at the pegs by the door, the line above the stove, the shelf that had never existed until today, and now could not be imagined away, and answered in the only register that felt honest. "Then we will keep making it true." Outside, the wind tried the latch one last time, found it uninterested in conversation, and went elsewhere to practice its speeches. Inside, 4 beings slept in the same geography without apology, and the door, newly taught, kept watch. The sky went the color of hammered pewter, and the wind that had spent itself on wolves returned with a different idea: witnesses. At first, Thorn thought it was another band of scavengers, but the shapes dripping down the ridge wore bone masks and clan sashes black as thaw water. Kareks, 5 on sleds, 3 on foot, the lead banner marked with the glyph that means decree. They did not knock. The law they carried never learned how. Valera stood before the door with Nail on her hip and Sarah anchored behind her knee, her crest braided tight to keep the cold from reading her fear. Thorn stepped beside her with his hat still on because he needed both hands free and because there are ceremonies he refuses to grant people who have not earned them. The eldest in bone trimmed in frost silver unrolled a scroll that had not been written in ink but in labor, the record of a verdict pronounced in a warm hall, so this conversation could take place in a cold field. "Valera of the Ledge," the elder said, voice wrapped in ritual, "declared sterile by the ring, set to silence beyond our sight. We come to confirm the silence and close the ledger." "This is my door," Thorn said, simple as a post-set plum. "I won't let you close anything that's still breathing." The younger mask-bearer to the right flinched at his Terran accent and lifted a weapon designed to humble wolves and men alike. Valera didn't move, but her voice sharpened to the tone that in any species means put that thing down if you expect to eat at my fire. "He dug us out," she said, and the twins, who had learned in 2 days that there are sentences you can carry like shields, echoed it in their smaller cadence. "Dug us out." The elder's gaze took in the pegs by the door. The extra mug hung low where little hands could claim it without asking, the shelf that had not existed last week and now could not be imagined away. Something old flickered behind the bone slits, something older than councils and rings, and the tidy cruelty of certainties. "There is a clause," he conceded grudgingly, "older than the ring, seldom used. Hearth-proof. 3 proofs required, breath saved from open cold, door that holds, fire that is shared with one who comes to take." Thorn didn't look at Valera because he had learned that some choices at a threshold are like a bird you'd spook by staring. He set the latch, then opened the door. Not wide, not in surrender, but exactly enough, and stood aside without stepping back. "I shared fire with wolves in better moods than yours," he said, not proud, simply accurate. "If you intend to take her, you'll eat first." They did not expect Stu to have standing. The youngest of them refused, and then realized no one else had followed his example. The elder accepted with the precise dignity of one who knows the difference between concession and wisdom. While the bowls steamed in their hands, the ridge decided to add another paragraph to the day. A cornice on the far shoulder of the gulch gave up its argument with gravity and shouldered down the slope in one long exhalation. The sound arrived before the snow and knocked the breath out of everything living. A child among the masks, the elder's granddaughter, by the quick jerk of his head, stumbled as the sled skidded sideways and would have gone under the white if Valera hadn't thrown nail to thorn and taken 3 steps that denied every assumption about the limits of bodies still healing. Thorn moved with her, because there is a physics to partnership that requires no rehearsal. He planted himself in the slide path, jammed the rescue rope into the sled bridle, and made of his shoulders a post the avalanche had not counted on. Sarah's whistle, a thin 2-note razor learned from vents in panic, cut through the roar and turned the twins' fear into something useful. The stove flared, the draft went outward, the white parted around hot air like a stream around a stone. When the world settled back into separate pieces, the child was alive and terrified. The elder was a grandfather again instead of a function, and the "take her back" that had sounded so official 10 minutes ago sat reheating at the bottom of a tin bowl. Valera stood in the middle of the yard with one knee ripped open and her frill glowing furious gold under the frost, both palms lifted in the old healer sign that means "you will not make me bandage this moment into silence." "Breath saved," the elder said quietly, as if dictating to a scribe who had finally learned how to spell humility. "Door that holds." He looked at the latch that still wore the mark of the wolf's nose and the ash smudge where Thorn had made heat into a boundary. "Fire shared," he finished, not quite believing he was grateful for Terran's stew and its argumentative steam. "2 now. The 3rd is yours to claim, Valera. Name the hearth." Valera did not hesitate because the time for hesitation had been spent on worse men. She took the braided cord from her wrist, the last unbroken thing her past had granted her, and laid it across Thorn's palm. "I claim this door," she said in Carrick's first, and then in Terran, so the snow and the man and the masks would all have to hear. "I claim this man's house. I claim the right to be the one who keeps it warm." A gust came down the ridge, curious as a child peering through a keyhole, and the elder did an old, awkward thing. He lifted off his bone mask so the decision would have to pass through a human face. "Hearth-proof granted," he said, slower now that the words weighed what they should. "The exile is closed, not by our mercy, but by her choosing. If there is a bond oath, make it before the storm changes its mind." Thorn could have said a lot, about rings and councils, about the way a man starts breathing again when somebody else shares the air on purpose, about a dog tag on a sill that had spent a year meaning only endings. He used fewer words, because the right ones are heavy and best delivered with 2 hands. "I'll keep the door," he told her. "You keep the fire." She nodded with a small, fierce economy that men who have survived foolish captains know to trust. The elder's granddaughter, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like ash and broth, watched with big eyes as Thorn knotted the braid to his dead wife's ring and set both back on the sill like a temporary star. Outside, the snow turned admiring and then shy. Inside, 3 cups steamed as if laws had always been this simple. Carrick's vows were meant for rings of elders and roar of drums. Terran vows assumed witnesses with chairs and a pen that didn't skip. Varellus 9 offered neither, so the ceremony took what the day handed it and made something sturdier. The elder brought out a strip of seal hide and cut it lengthwise, hands steady now that a life and a law had come back from beneath the white. Maidie, the granddaughter whose almost loss had mixed humility into the elder's diction, collected 3 pebbles warmed in Valera's palm until they were the temperature of decisions. Thorn lined the pegs by the door with twine and patience. Valera set the table with bowls that had learned the difference between guests and threats. Nael took Sarah's hand, and they marched their own one-step procession from bunk to hearth to door, whispering under their breath the two notes that had reminded the cabin how to push back against avalanches. The storm hung about at the window with bad manners but good curiosity, content to drum its fingers on the roof while people learned to speak up for themselves. "Say it the Terran way," Melis Oru would have said if she'd been here, and "say it the Karex way," Kellen would have added. But the only ones present were a handful of masks and a man who had learned to repair doors and a woman who had stopped waiting to be counted worthy by the wrong arithmetic. Thorn cleared his throat and felt the properly terrified tremor of any soldier asked to address the only audience that matters. "I can lift what needs lifting," he began, "because promises are safest when they start with the body. I can build the second room and teach the latch new tricks. I can be where my boots are when the weather goes wrong. I can make the pot go on and the fire stay kind and the words fit in the morning. If I fail, I will fail standing where you can find me." Valira answered not with poetry, but with the compact logic of healers and mothers and anyone who has fought councils with less than ideal resources. "I will tell you the wind when it changes. I will teach the door not to gossip our warm outside. I will keep the old songs in the cupboard with the salt and bring them out when the stew needs backbone. I will not let fear decide where we stand. If I leave a note, it will say when I am back and what I am bringing." On the sill, the ring and braid lay shoulder to shoulder like veterans who had agreed to retire from their old wars into this new one. The elder cut the seal hide into 2 short lengths and offered them across his palm like a test. "Not the door," he said, the ritual sentence older than even he had expected to meet again. Thorn looped 1 strip around the interior latch and tied the knot. Sailors and fathers and men who do not ask the wind for favors know by hand. A bend that holds under strain but can be cut quick if the house needs out. Valira tied the outside strip, he watched, admiring the economy in her fingers, into a loop that came undone if turned exactly so, but refused the grip of pause and panic. The elder grunted, which in his tribe is an ovation. "Door knows 2 new languages," he allowed. "Good. Now, gifts." They had no dowry but competence, no chest but the cupboard, and what they gave would not have impressed anyone who had never needed it. Thorn took his old dog tag, threaded it onto the braid, and hung it on the peg at child height, so 2 small people would learn to read the names of those who had kept doors before them. Valira took her healer's kit, emptied it onto the table, and slid 3 things into the house's keeping. A needle, because shirts and hearts require mending. A whistle, because vents and children obey clean notes. A tiny vial of oil, because every machine and many arguments go better with a drop of patience. Nail contributed a fist-sized rock that was very good at holding heat when left by the stove. Sarah, after a fierce consultation with herself, put on the shelf a bundle of dried wolf hair she had collected at the woodpile. A reminder, she said, that bravery can be taught manners. It should have ended there, tidy as a receipt, but Varellus 9 is not a planet that respects narrative closure. From the ridge came a sound men recognize in any century, a crack like a bad idea becoming law. A second cornice, higher, meaner, his twin delayed in every regard, let go and plunged toward the gulch, which had the decency to echo a warning. The Karex masks spun to run, and the elder did what elders seldom get the proper credit for. He did not move. "Hearthbound," he said, and his voice had lost the council's starch. "We hold together, or we dig together later." Thorn was already at the rope, anchoring it around the stove's iron legs, while Valira drove the sled spurs into the hardpack and made of the yard a crude web. She shouted angles, and he obeyed them because her math fit the slope better than his sense did. He hauled Mady onto the sill with a firefighter's economy, and Nail, serious, breath high, as official as a boy can be, tugged the elder's sleeve with a glare that was pure Valira, until the old man climbed inside, muttering that he did not need help, which was how anyone could tell he did. When the second slide hit, it found a house that had learned to take a punch. The web sang, the stove swore, the pegs held. The knot that could be cut did not need cutting. Snow surged around the walls, testing for gossip. The latch told it nothing. For a breathless span of seconds, everyone in the doorway existed in 3 time zones at once. The recent past where wolves argued with Ash, the present where marriage had decided to be useful, the near future where soup would be very, very necessary. And then the white shouldered off into the lower gully and composed itself like a guest pretending it had always meant to leave politely. Thorn leaned his forehead briefly against the door jamb, an old prayer with no God in it, and felt Valira's hand find the back of his neck with the exact pressure that tells a man to keep living like this on purpose. The elder straightened his sash, which had lost its starch permanently, and replaced the bone mask like a man who has agreed to play his old part with new meaning. "Hearth recognized," he said to the official heir, "because words like to be written down even when they have already happened. Bond sworn, door holds." He looked at the twins the way grandfathers do when they find themselves unexpectedly in possession of more work than they had scheduled, and added, very softly, "Line continues." His men, shamed by Avalanche and Stu into better manners, sketched a bow that looked nothing like condescension. Then they loaded their sleds and took their old laws away to learn new tricks. The cabin exhaled. People tend to forget buildings breathe, but Thorn had always known. He set the pot back on, not because anyone was hungry yet, but because a house should always smell like it intends mercy. Valira sat on the threshold with her knees up and her back against the post, stitches peeking at her skin where the slide had kissed too hard, and let the twins braid her hair with the wolf fur, as if telling the day it had been seen and forgiven in the same minute. One by one, the witnesses slipped away. The storm, disappointed that it had failed to prevent a wedding, sulked across the ridge to bother less prepared doors. When only their 4 remained, Thorn lifted the braid and ring from the sill, looped it over the interior peg, and tied the smallest knot he knew, a plain square, the kind sailors teach children when the real work is making them feel the rope learning their hands. Valira reached, made it double, and pressed the knot flat with her thumb, until it remembered this shape was permanent. They ate with the slightly hysterical appetite that follows days that could have gone differently. The stew was a little smoky, the bread a little underdone, the lemon rationed to a single bright drop each, and it was the best meal Thorn had ever cooked. Valira raised her spoon the way Carracks do at rites of gratitude, a private gesture she shared with him now without apology. Thorn touched the dog tag on his wrist and declined, for the first time in a long time, to count the dead before he swallowed. Nail fell asleep, leaning against Sarah. Sarah stayed awake out of sheer contrariness to be the last to witness the new arrangement of the furniture of fate. When Thorn banked the fire and set the latch, the house learned another small skill: how to make the click sound like a promise instead of a lock. And when the wind came back at midnight to ask if anything here could be talked out of its choices, the door, newly married, recently proven, properly proud, answered in wood and iron. Not tonight.